best practices and things to consider when translating content, presented today by Peter Argandizzo and Jose Semeno. We've got a great webinar today for you, so we're excited to have them present. The format for today will be 1 hour. The presentation should go about 40-45 minutes, and we'll take questions at the end, so feel free to send us questions throughout the webinar, and then we'll get to them once we're done. Again, this webinar is being recorded, so everybody will get a link once it is made available online, so you can view it later. So without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Peter.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you all for attending, and I think we'll go ahead and jump right into to our slides. Hoping to make this a little bit more of a discussion, so there will be a portion to ask some questions near the end, and I'm hoping to cover some of the larger aspects or some of the key issues that we don't see our clients consider enough before they launch into translation projects. And I hope you find these useful, and we'll also make some contact information available at the end of the presentation, so if we run out of time for questions and such, you'll be able to contact us afterwards. So let's go ahead and get started. One of the big issues that we see is text expansion. As you can imagine, in translation, once you go into other languages, the languages can expand. So for example, Spanish, French, Italian, Portuguese, some of these languages can expand as much as 30%. So it's really important to make sure to plan your layout so it's flexible enough to allow the content to expand. Some of the languages, such as Dutch and German, will even expand by 35% or more. On the flip side of that, there are some Asian languages that will actually contract. So that's another consideration you have to make in your templates and your style guides. The content can shrink as much as up to 55%. You also have to be aware that some languages like Chinese can expand vertically and increase in character height. So you also have to be aware of the spacing in between lines.
Peter,
some of the guys, yes, sir.
Excuse me, sir. Are you still on the opening slide, or had you gone to the first slide? Or I didn't know if we're still paused.
No, I apologize. There must be an issue. Hold on one second. Let me make sure. I did actually switch slides, so sorry that's not coming through. One moment.
There we go.
Let me just make sure that my screen is on. Are you able to see the guidelines?
Yep, I see guidelines now.
Okay,
Yep,
great. Sorry about that. Technical glitch there. So some of the guidelines that we thought we would suggest would be to be careful when abbreviating text into small spaces. So in other words, if you're having to abbreviate because of small space already in English, that's definitely going to pose a problem in translation. Some examples are that we often see is FAQ. You know, say you have a small tab, and you put the letters FAQ on there. Well, FAQ does not mean anything in translation. So for example, in Spanish, and forgive my Spanish pronunciation, but it would be preguntas frecuentes. So you definitely have to plan that those abbreviations will not work in translation. You also have to understand there are some languages like German, Finnish, and Dutch that use compound nouns. So if you have some content where you're stringing together some nouns, invariably you may have some compound nouns, which will cause issues with wrapping. You want to try to design the document with as much flexibility as possible to allow the text to reflow. We've had some customers that have purposely put in 15 to 20 to 25% white space in their print channels. In other words, the bottom of the page in the English document doesn't fill up. Or they may have a plan where they decrease the font size slightly in the translated content. You also want to, make sure to avoid small and fixed with headers, tabs, buttons, and graphics. That's also incredibly important. If you have some images where you have callouts and the space that you're allowing for those callouts is already completely consumed by the English, that'll definitely be an issue going into translation. And not only will this make the process smoother for you, but you have to understand that if you allow for these things, you'll make the desktop publishing effort or the design effort that much easier. You'll keep your costs down, the additional hours that you have to provide the desktop publishers to finish the projects, as well as the QA process, because there's nothing, you definitely at all costs want to avoid sending out something in your print channel or online that has some words that are cut off. That's definitely a mistake that you don't want to make with your clients. I thought I'd actually provide an example in German. So this is the phrase TV marketing strategy. So just to show you an example in German, TV is, and again, German is not my language. My language is Italian, actually, but bear with me. German TV is Fernsehen, and marketing is just marketing, and strategy is Strategie. And you actually, those three words will become one word, which is this very long German word, Fernsehen, marketing strategy, which is entertainment, just to hear me try to say that word in German. But as you can imagine, if that word were appearing in the line, you definitely have a wrap issue here. So definitely something that has to be addressed. And of course, as an example of what not to provide, this is definitely a web page that wasn't designed to be localized or translated. So pretty colors, but a horrible design there. Next, we wanted to proceed to the proper use of conditional text. And a tool like MadCap Flare handles it a little bit differently. So this is where I wanted to transition to Jose, where he he'll talk to you a little bit about snippets and conditional text within the context of Flare.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So conditions and snippets and things like variables are what we call from the Flare side, and just single source audio in general, or single source publishing in general. They're terms that we use in elements of content publishing for single sourcing. And what it really means, single sourcing, and this is right from our help here, single sourcing is a fancy term that means something very simple: to produce multiple results from one source. And using Flare, you can make use of single sourcing with snippets and variables and conditions all combined together, so it can get very, very powerful. And conditions specifically allow you to target maybe specific user groups or maybe specific products, and selectively have one set of content where you have an advanced user group, and then maybe you generate an output that's a basic user group, but you're maintaining that content in the same file. So for local localization, that can be difficult to manage because both sets of content are going to be in the file that the translator is actually working with. And when you include things like snippets and variables, a snippet is a piece of content that's embedded and referenced inside of a topic from another file. So you can include your snippet in 100 different topics, and a good example of that is something like a copyright statement, a legal statement, maybe your address, and include it multiple places, but it's always updated from one source file that's just referenced in the topic. Variables is that same concept of it. Variables are just usually individual terms or small definitions of sets of terms, like a phone number would be a good variable. And you can use that in many places throughout the content, but still control it from a variable tag set. In that sense, single sourcing is going to be the most efficient way for authoring content with the greatest efficiency for content reuse. But for localization, that can be a lot of confusion for the translator working with the files, because especially when you're referencing embedded files from other places, depending on what tool you're using for translation, that can look differently. But those are all single sourcing elements of a Flare project, and then just single source documentation publishing in general.
Great, thank you, Jose. So that's a great explanation of basically the definition of those two concepts, so actually three if you're considering variables as well. One of the things that I wanted to address is how those are used. They're great from an author's perspective. So, and we definitely encourage the use of it. Snippets are great. We've seen customers use them for many different things. Probably the most popular, of course, is standard cautions and warnings, which is a very typical thing in technical documentation. It's great because, of course, update once and propagate many times is the idea. Unfortunately, I think sometimes the idea is applied that, gee, if we can conditionalize so much that we'll end up saving money in the translation perspective. And that's really not the best way of viewing it. What you really want to look at is is write the content so it makes sense for you as the author. In other words, I'm going to make this snippet because I know it changes. This is snippet because this content changes from time to time. Because remember, you have another safety net, and that safety net is the translation memory. So with translation memory, of course, if you have something that's repetitive, you're still going to see savings through repetitions. What you don't want to do is something like this. This is just an example where a client may do something where it's a variable is forbidden for use outside of the United States. Well, this is problematic. This is problematic for a few reasons. Because of course, in translation, many times you have reverse word order. In other words, the translated sentence will come out in a completely different order. There's also gender and number. So if our translator has to assign gender and number, they don't necessarily know what that variable is, and that can become burdensome. There's ways to mitigate that, but it's just something you should understand. And there's also declensions. There are some languages that use endings. So if they don't necessarily know what that variable is, they don't know if it requires an ending. And again, this also reduces the effectiveness of the translation memory. So you have to be very careful in how you use these. What we suggest is that you look at your conditional text and your snippets and do complete ideas. Please don't conditionalize a part of a sentence. Conditionalize an entire sentence or entire thought. Same thing with snippets. We have seen some clients get very granular with snippets where they're making partial sentence snippets. And that's very difficult because now the translator, to translate effectively, has to understand what the content is. So if we go on to the next topic, which is managing an internal review, this is by far what I would call the black hole of the translation industry. In other words, it's a problem that most of our clients have. It gets very difficult, and there's some key issues that, if addressed, can make this a little easier to manage. Most clients will require some sort of internal sign-off on their documents. And that's to be understood. We do peer review, right? From most technical writers will do a peer review, so why wouldn't that be done with translation and get internal buy-in? But one of the things that our clients tend to miss from time to time is that the reviewer must have a deep knowledge of the topic. In other words, far too often we'll see that there's this great thought that's put into, gee, who's going to write this content, and let's vet all of their qualifications and what do they know about the industry, and they're going to write this topic. Then we put all this energy into, gee, how do we select our translation vendor? Let's make sure that they have the right skill set and the right experience to do this. But then when it comes to reviewing the document, they'll just say, well, gee, you know what? My friend's son is a third-year Spanish student in high school, and I think he can review this. And of course, that's not the case. I mean, I can actually give you some real-life examples. We did a very technical document for a client, and he was very proud of himself, and he took it to a trade show. He met an individual at the trade show, and he said, gee, I've got this fancy new Spanish brochure. He said, well, that's great. I have my son with me, and he's studying Spanish. Can he review it? So, of course, he looks at it and says, wow, I don't understand any of this. The content was so technical. Unfortunately, this was a sophomore in high school studying Spanish. He had no clue what it was, but he didn't really have a clue as to what it was in the English. So I think it's very important that you consider the qualifications of the reviewer. Make sure that it's someone internal who has the proper language skills and also has a deep understanding of the topic, both in the source language and the target language. Bilingual does not equal qualified. I want to make sure to stress that out. Then once you've selected the reviewer, you'll also want to follow some other guidelines. Ask your reviewers to mark up errors and terminology changes. That's really where you're going to get the most bang for your buck with your translation vendor. Stylistic changes really shouldn't be made. If it's a marketing piece and there's some sort of directive from the marketing department, perhaps. But with technical documentation, you certainly don't want to spend time on stylistic changes. You really want to focus on terminology and if you were to find any errors. To save the reviewer time, and also make sure they have the right tools. For example, that they know how to use a markup tool like in Adobe Acrobat, or they have some ability to do sort of what we consider like a track changes. And you'll want them to suggest global changes rather than mark up every instance. For example, if they want to change a term across the board, allow them to mark it once and depend on your translation team to make those changes globally, which is very easy using tools like Lingo or even other translation management systems. And again, to make things clear, you'll want to have some sort of strategy in mind about how you're going to show those changes. Far too often we get changes that are written on the back of a cocktail napkin, and it's very difficult for everyone concerned to make those changes consistently. Great, so now I wanted to cover translation memory. So we've talked a little bit about translation memory, and this is something that you should understand because, of course, it'll represent, it could represent a large portion of savings in your budget, especially if you're publishing in multiple languages. So the key components of translation memory are that it's going to save you money, and it's also going to save you time on updates and revisions of your documentation. It's also going to increase consistency across projects. So if your vendor is using translation memory properly, even when they say have to change translation teams because it's a very busy period, or if you have a very busy period and you're releasing multiple documents, that translation memory will be a consistency tool as well. You'll want to understand the role of translation memory in your update strategy. In other words, when we're doing these updates, how do we control the language so that we're getting the most money out of this translation memory? You want to make sure that when you're making changes to your documentation, that you're not doing that so-called improving the English too often. In other words, we recently did a review for a client where they went in and they weren't happy with some of the capitalization strategy. Another one wasn't so happy with the length of the sentences. They were too short and choppy, so they decided to do something that flowed. Well, understand that if you do those kinds of changes, you potentially could invalidate your translation memory. In other words, if the last manual was built on a certain structure of your content, and you go in and change that structure, you could invalidate huge chunks of the translation memory. You want to understand the impact of tweaking content. And I thought just so you understand the three key components that your translation vendor might talk about, you'll hear them say 100% match. So what does 100% match mean? That means you have a sentence in document A that has an identical sentence in another document, whether that's a revision or if you're doing a multiple release. It's the same sentence that occurs in two different documents. So we've translated it in document A, and now the sentence comes up again in document B. That would be considered 100% match and should be discounted. Then you'll hear the concept of a repetition. So a repetition instead is, let's say you have a large manual, and you have, again, a warning or a caution or something that's repetitive, and it repeats itself within the same document. That's considered a repetition. So the key there, same sentence in the same document. Then there's this concept of a fuzzy match. So a fuzzy match is basically you have a sentence that you've done in document A, but then in document B, there's a small change to it. So that also carries a level of discount from your translation vendor. So an example in text and not fruit would be fuzzy matches. Please select the print option to print out all selected reports. In another document, you may see it as please choose the print option. So, for example, that would come up as a fuzzy match because the translator and the editor only have to make a small tweak to the content. Now, just your vendor can actually run very, very detailed reports. So they can run a report on a huge set of documents or a very complex help system that has hundreds or thousands of topics. And from that report, they can determine exactly how many words are in the content, how many repetitions, how many fuzzy matches, and they can also suggest a strategy. So for example, if you know that you're not doing all the documents at once, but you're doing some of the documents first, and then you want to get those done and then move on to another portion, they can actually help with the strategy by analyzing the documents, and sometimes can work out a scenario that maximizes how much is discounted. In other words, they're trying to figure out the proper workflow on the documents to maximize the savings. So be aware that your translation vendor should be able to generate this data for you. I also wanted to bring up the idea of regional considerations. So, we do get customer calls from time to time, and they'll say, gee, I'd like to translate this document in Portuguese. Or, gee, I'd like to do this in French. And when we ask, well, gee, what is the sublanguage? They're not 100% sure. What we would suggest is make sure that you, of course, understand your target market. And if the answer is, well, gee, we have some customers in Brazil, but we have some customers in Portugal, what we usually suggest to our customers, if you only have enough budget money to do one, what you'd want to do is look at your market share. In other words, if 90% of your clients are in Brazil for this given market, but 10 are in Portugal, well, then you might want to make an economic decision in that way. Of course, the ideal solution would be to really translate two versions. And I would suggest that if you are going to go to both markets, that really is the best way to go. There's also this conversation of Spanish. Obviously, as you can imagine, there are many Spanish-speaking countries. And depending on your target audience, you may need to do multiple versions of Spanish. There is this sort of idea of neutral Spanish, and it does exist. There is sort of this idea of neutral Spanish, and I think it has an inverse relationship to how technical your document is. That's also something to keep aware. The more you lean towards something that's for a marketing, for marketing considerations, if it's a brochure or portions of your website, I think then you really should do more tailored versions. And of course, this idea exists with many other languages, but another one that we hear is, of course, Canadian French versus European French. So some of the things you might want to consider as well that I actually didn't mention here is the register. So another idea is understanding what is the proper register. Obviously, if you're addressing a group of physicians, it might be very different than addressing a group of patients. So you'll also want to make sure that you're using the proper register when you're translating the document. You want to make sure that your vendor understands who the target audience is. Some of the things you may want to look at are the units of measure in your documentation, the toll-free numbers, references to local authorities, like, for example, 911, or referring to the TSA, the FAA, FDA, or HIPAA. Those are all concepts that obviously don't necessarily exist in translation, would have to be modified by your translator, and also references to social programs or benefits like Social Security and 401k and health insurance, IRAs, Section 529s. You'll also want to make sure to address any slang, humor, or catchphrases that may not translate well, and also, especially, again, in your marketing content. I can give you an example. There was a client of ours that was rolling out a new cardiology product, and the main line on the brochure was the art of cardiology. And of course, when our team had a look at this, and it was going into Europe, we realized that that really wouldn't be the best in translation. And that's because in Europe, physicians tend to put themselves on a little bit different social category, say, than an artist, and they would actually probably be offended by that allusion. In other words, by comparing them to an artist. So we helped the client to come up with something that was going to play better with their target audience, which in this case was cardiologists. Okay. And I thought at this point we would go ahead and open it up for questions. I know I breezed through those topics a little bit and would be happy to dive into those a little bit more, or if you had any other questions about any other topics you'd like to discuss relative to translation, please feel free to use the question panel and submit your questions.
All right. Yeah, well, I think we got a couple of questions so far, Peter. And this one came in when we were talking about variables and some of those other elements for single sourcing. And someone brought up, and maybe you can address this, but are some of those issues, especially with variables, I take it, are those resolved when creating a glossary file for the translators, where you have terminology in a glossary separate from an actual variable? So maybe just anything that you can speak to about glossaries in general to working with this type of content.
Sure, there's a couple great topics in there. So I think I think it's a great idea. In fact, we're working on a project right now where the client was gracious enough to allow us to translate the glossary first. And then that glossary is going to go to internal review. And once that's approved, that'll really set the road for success in terms of the translation project. Because now you have all of the key terminology translated, edited, reviewed, and approved by the client. The rest of the project should go quite smoothly. So I kind of see that as two different options, I think, or two different issues to discuss. The glossary idea, I think, is great, and that's actually usually a great component as well, and a good help system is where you have some of the keywords defined for your users. So I think it serves a lot of purposes in translation, helps the quality, helps set the team. And when I say the team, I refer to everyone, again, the translator, the editor, as well as the client's SME, and that works out really well. In terms of the variables, the ways that we've used to mitigate that is if there is a print target, if we're talking about help and there's a print target, we'd ask that those print targets are generated, or we would generate them. And we use those as reference for the translator so they can do some searches, say, in a PDF and look for different uses of that sentence. So they might search on the sentence, without the variable, obviously, and look at the different ways it may be used. And if it's used so dramatically different, it's something we have to address with the customer where we can track down, well, we may need to not use this variable or conditionalize it in a different way because we're going to have to translate it in these sentences in two different ways. One of the great options in Flare, in Lingo, is that you can, in essence, flatten the variables. When you're importing the project, you can choose to show the variables as text. In other words, you replace the variables with their actual text. That would eliminate that issue. The only concern then would be with the author. You'd have to let them know that you've gotten rid of the variable functionality because you're actually translating that as content. So there are definitely ways to mitigate that.
Yeah. All right. Great. This is something this question kind of pertains to something that we've talked about in the past, QAing, the actual translation workflow. The question was, I understand what you're saying about having a qualified reviewer, but what if you have no one? Is the only alternative to rely on the translation vendor for their own review?
That's a great question. So, we have customers that come from, all walks of life. In other words, we have customers that don't have internal subject matter experts that they can rely on. And yes, at that point, you really do have to depend on your vendor. I would suggest looking at their steps. I would ask them to be transparent. One of the things that's going on, it's sort of the dark underside, the sort of the dark secret that's going on in our industry is there are a lot of vendors that are taking shortcuts in what I would consider an acceptable workflow. So there are vendors that are using, say, machine translation as a first step, and then just having someone review it. I would suggest to any buyer of translation services to ask, what is the workflow? What is the role of translation memory technology, including machine translation? I want to know that up front, and I would challenge them to be transparent about it and make sure they stick to it. And if your vendor is following a good strategy, it would definitely be that at a minimum they're doing translation, and there's an independent editor with the same linguistic skills. And that's important as well, with the same type of linguistic skills as your translator, because all too often, another way to preserve margin that a lot of vendors are doing is they're just having a project manager do what, in essence, I would call, in the old days, we would call that a page check, where they're basically just flipping pages, counting paragraphs. Gee, this looks like French to me. That's not a review. That's not an edit. So make sure that your vendor is indeed doing all the steps. I know in our workflow, we actually, everything, it's part of the ISO standard is that it has to be translated, has to be reviewed by an independent editor, and there's also a bunch of QA tests that the translation management system runs, and those are all important to having a successful translation. And that's not to say that your vendor won't make a mistake. It can happen, but make sure you talk about how you're going to address those. The clients that we have that kind of do it on their own, they always, on their last page, have an email address where you can write if you have feedback or concerns, and make sure to share that strategy with your vendor. Say, hey, if there's any concerns or feedback that come in, will you help me resolve them? And try to get them to commit to some sort of timeline to make sure you're doing it in a timely fashion. And thankfully, with translation memory technology, if you do discover some errors, you can go in, make the changes, and make them across the board so that then when the next project comes, the next update comes, that same mistake will not repeat itself. For me, the bottom line is translation vendors make mistakes. All of them do. The difference is the good ones react quickly, and they do so objectively. You admit you make a mistake, you fix it, you understand why it was made, and you make sure it doesn't happen again.
Great. All right, this talks about something more along the lines of the translation memory. Can we take fuzzy matches literally? In other words, if 5 of the 10 words are the same as 50% fuzzy match, is that generally going to be the understanding when you're looking at a suggestion coming from the TM?
So let's see if I understand it correctly.
Are they sort of, can we take fuzzy matches literally? So when you see 50% match, does that really equate to a 50% of the words matching, 5 out of 10 in the translation memory?
So I have a funny answer. It depends which 5, right?
Yeah.
So we have customers that make defibrillators. My guess is that they probably wouldn't be comfortable with that assumption, right? So it really depends on your level of tolerance for, gee, what happens if there were a mistake in my documentation. I wouldn't suggest it as such. Because again, not knowing the topic, I mean, maybe if it's something so low level or internal communication, maybe that's okay. But even still, I wouldn't suggest it. What the idea behind the matches, the repetition, the fuzzy matches, the idea is that you're reducing the labor time, right? In the end, when you're paying your translation vendor, they're trying to extrapolate some sort of hourly rate, right? That's how most labor is calculated across all industries. So the idea is that the translator is saving time. They come across this sentence that's very similar to something they've done in the past. They can simply accept it, which in other words puts that 50% match into their work area, and they quickly modify it. So the idea is that it takes less time to do than if they had nothing. That's really the idea behind all of this. And repetitions, of course, that's the reason repetitions and 100% matches are discounted more deeply, if not completely, versus fuzzy matches, is because it's no time at all. You look at the sentence, you say, oh my gosh, this is an exact match, accept, move on. It's no time at all. So that's really where the idea behind the discounts on matches and repetitions comes from.
All right. And this is a good question here, I think. And this is they've specifically asked for a tool-agnostic method. So we know how to do this with file tags and things like that in Flare. But can you suggest a good way to tell translators what content is not to be translated? In their docs, for example, they have code fragments, system error codes, and all sorts of things that are going to be displayed to the end user the same. So how can you highlight that with a tool-agnostic method?
Oh, that's a sticky one, because there's a couple different ways, and maybe if the author of the question comes back, Jose, let us know on that, comes back to you with a follow-on or an add-on. So XML, of course, is great for that sort of thing, because you can be very specific in your tags. So obviously, if you have a specific tag that you're using, say, hey, never translate these 6 tags, that's incredibly easy for a translation vendor to parse and say, well, this content is excluded. So if there's XML structure to what you're translating, that solves that problem. If there's not, you can, there are some different ways to do this. This goes back to some of the older technology that was used in translation memory. If you have, say, content that's in some other authoring tool like Word or something like that. You could use colors, you could use styles. Those are all things that are parsable. by translation memory tools. If you're using a tool like Flare, that's organized more around topics and tiny containers of data, you can use you could build your own lingo project if you wanted to, and just mark the topics that you don't want translated as, leave those as untranslated and say, vendor, please only translate the ones that are marked sent out for translation. So it really depends. There's no easy answer, so I'll apologize for that. But the idea is to sort of think outside of the box depending on where your content currently lives. XML is probably by far the easiest because you could just implement some tags around the content that you don't want translated.
Yeah, yeah. It's tough to answer that question without a specific tool to tie it to, because different tools are going to handle that separately, I think.
Yes.
Depending on what you're sending the translator.
Absolutely, and I would warn against. So again, think of all your projects in this way. If I cannot define my scope really clearly, what am I going to get back in terms of the mistakes? Because remember, let's say we have some customers that build projects in 32 languages. So here's something that technical writers or purchasers of translation services don't often think. That means if your vendor is doing exactly what they should be doing, your translation team is now 64 people. So let's make sure that what we're doing is repeatable and it can be done very easily so that all 64 people understand exactly what they're doing. And in some of those old strategies, we were saying, hey, don't translate the blue content, or don't translate the content that's tagged like this. If you're not using a tool that actually locks that content, your project manager will have a nightmare, because with a team of 64 people, I guarantee you that at least 15 or 20% of them will screw it up, and they'll translate the content that you didn't intend them to. So you always want to make sure that you have an ability to sort of lock that content, and that's really when we parse translation projects, that's really what we're doing. Is if the client is communicating that sort of information to us, we make sure that that material is locked down. It can perhaps be seen, but not touched or edited.
Yeah. All right. Next question. This is a good best practices question. I had heard that we should avoid using contractions in text that will be translated. Is this also a best practice?
Well, one would hope that your translator would understand how to deal with that. I don't know that I would go as far as saying a best practice. You would probably have some technical writers that would argue that, gee, you shouldn't do that in your source. But I don't know. We have some customers that are sort of in the new sort of social media realm, and the way that they communicate is far more casual and far more casual is probably the best way to say it. So we see all sorts of things that I would probably a few years ago say don't really fit into the realm of a best practice. So I probably wouldn't go as far as saying as to include that in a best practice, but
you say not necessary anymore, maybe in the past, but no longer.
Yeah,
okay?
Exactly.
And all right, the next one is actually a product question that I think I might take, and this is something that comes up quite a bit. The actual question is, it is quite often a challenge to send the translator all the files needed for the translation in Flare and Lingo, in Flare, and Lingo might not be an option based on company requirements of translation tool use. Are there plans to make the project packager for Lingo available as a separate utility for a fee so projects can be packaged and translated with other systems outside of Lingo? And just to address that question, in the past, I think it was maybe version 4 or 5, Lingo actually generated translation bundles in the HTML file format. Now, with the past few versions of Lingo and the current release of Lingo v7, that project packager, when you create that Lingo project, the very first thing that it does with your source files, whether they be Flare files, Word docs, InDesign, or anything like that, any of the other file types Lingo can work with, Lingo converts those to valid X lists. And so now working with Lingo, you can use Lingo as the translation management tool that allows you to create, using the project packager, the translation bundle of XLIF files. So using Lingo today, the bundles created for your translator can be translated in any tool that can work with the industry standard file type of XLIF. And when you get those translations back, you have the ability to maintain your own translation memory and term base with Lingo. So that's something I definitely wanted to make sure we clarified, that Lingo definitely follows the industry standard format for localization data exchange, which is the XLIF file, and for translation memory exchange, the TMX file, which is just an export from a translation memory, and the TBX format for term-based exchange. So just using Lingo alone, you can work with any translation tool and any translation vendor around the world using the project packager function. So I just wanted to make sure we clarified. In the past, multiple versions of Lingo ago, that wasn't the case. Now it is. And you can speak to that in any capacity that you'd like as well, about just using tools and XLIFs and things like that if you'd like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd like to reinforce that. Any of the tools that are out there that support XLIF, which are most of them, most of the larger tools, at least there may be a few that aren't, but the Trados, SDLX, Across, MemoQ, Deja Vu, all these guys would certainly support the XLIF. And what's nice in Lingo as well, that I can add, that the bundling process is quite easy, and if for some reason you don't want to include all the content, it's really just shift clicking on, or control clicking on the items that you want to include in the bundle, and it's quite easy to do, and your translation vendor would not be constrained to use Lingo. And the import, if you are the person managing that project, it's not very difficult then to import those resources back into Lingo as well.
All right. Next question. We have, as an American, turns of phrases and idioms are as unconscious as breathing. Are there, which is an idiom in itself, are there lists someplace of common phrases in English to avoid for European translations?
Boy, that's a great question. I don't know of any lists per se. I know of certainly some books that have been written, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but this would be, a lot of these books came out sort of at the advent of the EU, and when this big push for business into Europe was coming, and there were some books that sort of addressed those things. But for me personally, I would say avoid them completely.
Just the idioms in general.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. They for lack of a better catchphrase, they do get lost in translation. And the other thing, again, remember in talking about these multiple language projects, if you're publishing in 15 languages, can you really guarantee how all 15 of those linguists are going to interpret what you were trying to say? And there's been lots of jokes about different marketing efforts by different companies and how they were poorly translated and how funny they sounded in translation. So I would avoid them at all costs. And if it's so important to your marketing strategy, then you really have to look at them country by country or language by language and say, all right, we need humor. We absolutely have to have humor in this campaign. So how are we going to get to a point where we have some of this humor that we have in the English campaign? How do we get to that in the foreign country or the foreign language? And that's sort of a whole different animal.
All right. I think we can do one more here. Let me see here. And this is more to the QA side, and I think this is a good place to end because you and I have talked about this quite thoroughly about the reliability of the translations, and this is about the internal review. When you have an internal translator, when you're not working with an external vendor, would you recommend having them included on the initial internal review team rather than at the end of the project, even if they have never been on the team previously? So having your translator that you have in-house as part of that review team, do you think that this should be isolated, or just in your experience professionally, how does that maybe normally go?
So we've seen that, and this is what I would call a people question. So we've, in our experience, we've seen that work well, in certain instances and work very poorly in others. It really becomes a people question. And maybe you've seen this in your own processes where you say, gee, you know, I usually don't go to Jose for internal review because, wow, does he put the red ink on my document? I'm not too crazy about that, so I'm going to go to Tom instead. It's very similar with this internal review process. You have to understand, well, gee, can this person that used to do this job be objective enough to be a good internal reviewer? And if the answer to that question is yes, then I think that's fine. I think that's great. In fact, there are some things you can do to have that internal reviewer be really helpful to the process. If you're not able to create translation memory because you were never really using translation memory tools, perhaps you can take some of the documents that they've translated in the past and provide those as reference. If they had compiled any glossary that they may have done on their own, or sometimes some companies will even do sort of like a little style guide, and a little translated style guide, please make sure to include that information when you start with your translation vendor. A very, very common thing that happens to companies is that, gee, they have one market, one customer that's doing something in a language, and they say, well, hey, great, we have this person internally, and they'll go ahead and translate. Well, the business starts to grow, and that person, of course, starts to become overtasked because invariably they have other responsibilities, and that's typically when vendors come, translation vendor is brought on board. And I think just as long as the person that was previously involved can be objective enough to be a good internal reviewer, then I think that would be recommended. It would be great to have them involved in the process. You just have to be very careful. The internal review is very tricky. If you talk to almost any translation vendor, they'll tell you that that's one of their big challenges, because no matter what systems you put in place or no matter what steps you take, in the end it's a people person. It's a people problem, because if the person's not objective, they go back to their boss and say this translation is horrible, and they don't give them any markups or they don't give them any content to go off of, and it really just sets you on a bad path. So I would definitely make sure you address that up front, perhaps doing some translation samples or getting that person involved early so they feel like they've helped make the choice. Maybe that's a way to mitigate that as well.
Well, I think that was a great answer, and I think that's all we're going to have time for now. We'll definitely address all of the questions that we didn't get to in the FAQ as well. If you have any other further questions, you can definitely feel free to reach out to Peter and myself. And I'm available on Twitter at MadCapJose. And Peter, if you want to kind of close out your side of things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Just want to say thank you very much for attending. I hope I was able to provide some information. Some of these topics, obviously, we could dig very deep on, and we certainly didn't hit all the topics, but I hope the ones that we did hit were helpful. And thank you again for attending. Thank you.